Well, we live in a time when we are supposed to be guided by the science. Unfortunately, when people say the science, what they very often mean is a particularly radical perspective on human life and what we should do with it. Joining us on the line to discuss is Bjorn Lomborg. He's president of the Copenhagen Consensus and visiting fellow at Hoover Institution at Stanford University. His new book is False Alarm: How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. Professor Lomborg, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Great to be here.
So why don't we start with a simple question? Should we be all that panicked over global warming at this point? We've been told by our politicians, by many in the media, that basically we're all going to die over the course of the next 100 years, not because we all die eventually, but simply because of the cost of global warming. What are the true costs of global warming?
Yeah, so fundamentally, global warming is a real problem. It's by no means the end of the world. Look, a recent survey actually showed that almost half of all adults in the world now believe that global warming is likely to lead to the extinction of the human race. There's no such thing. The UN Climate Panel, so it's typically known as the gold standard of what we know about global warming, the science that you just talked about, it tells us that in 50 years, the impact of global warming will be equivalent of making all of us 0.2 to 2% less well off. And remember, by then we'll be much richer. So what we're really talking about, it's a slight reduction in the increase of our wealth by 50 years. That's not the end of the world. That's a problem.
So when we talk about some of the problems that we've been hearing about, one of the things we've been hearing about is the idea there's going to be vast depopulation of certain areas, that mass migration is going to destabilize borders. We can blame war on global warming. We can see an uptick in intensity of hurricanes. What do you make of some of these claims?
Well, so I actually walk through a lot of these claims in my book and use the best data that we have. And most of these are vastly exaggerated. Some of them have a little bit of truth to them. So again, global warming is a problem, but it's by no means the end of the world. So one of the examples is last year we had this scenario. It was the headline in Washington Post and many other papers around the world. It told us that because of global warming, because of sea level rise, which is real, it would drown 187 million people across the world. That's a huge number. What had they done? They had looked at sea level rise and then assumed nobody would do anything the next 80 years. They would simply watch the sea lap up over their knees at eventually hips and eventually drown everybody. Of course, if you assume that people are actually going to take action, build better dikes and so on, the very same research tells us with smart action, we're going to see 300,000 people who have to move by the end of the century. Remember, that's half of the number of people that move out of California every year. So this is not the end of the world. It is, again, a problem, but we're often being told just one side and one very particular side that tells you an incredibly alarmist picture.
So, Professor Lomborg, there have been a bunch of sort of strategies that people have proposed for dealing with climate change. These really span two categories. One would be mitigation and the other would be adaptation. Mitigation would be the idea that we do things to stop global warming now. This is what, of course, everybody in the sort of Greta Thunberg camp is focused in on, restructuring the entire world economy so as to prevent carbon emissions from continuing to be spewed into the atmosphere. And then there's a second school of thought that says, okay, well, a lot of this is already baked into the cake. We don't know how much is baked into the cake. But one thing that human beings are really, really good at is adaptation. And maybe that includes creating solutions to bringing carbon down out of the air. There's machines that are capable of doing this. Maybe this has to do with building more dikes and facilitating human movement. Do you come down more on the adaptation or the mitigation side of this strategy?
So like all smart things, we're going to pick all of the above. So we are going to do a lot of adaptation, and it's going to be very easy and fairly cheap, and it will solve many of the problems. Like we just talked about, not 187 million people who have to move, but 300,000. But we should also cut emissions, but do so smartly. Right now, everyone seems to be suggesting, let's cut emissions while it's still incredibly expensive. Not surprisingly, that basically means nobody ends up doing anything. In a very surprisingly honest review, the UN told us last year that for all the effort for the Greta Thunbergs and Al Gores and Obamas of this world who really tried hard, they can't tell the difference over the last 15 years of us trying the hardest we could and actually having no climate policy whatsoever since 2005. So the reality is our current approach doesn't work. It spends lots of resources, but it doesn't actually work. What we do need to do is to dramatically increase investment in green energy research. Look, if Right now, it's very expensive to switch to low or zero carbon energy, which is why it's not happening, which is why just rich, well-meaning Americans will do a little bit, but the rest of the world, which is poor, will not. But if we could innovate the price of green energy down below fossil fuels, everyone would switch, not just Americans, but also Chinese, Indians, Latin Americans, everybody else. And that, of course, would also solve a large part. So both adaptation and mitigation, but smart stuff that's cheap, but incredibly effective.
Professor Lomborg, one of the pitches that's been made by everybody from Al Gore to Thunberg and everybody else has been the idea of a carbon tax. I've always been skeptical of the idea that you're ever going to get a global carbon tax going, simply because if you're a developing country or if you're a country that is unanswerable like China, why in the world would you sign on to that? I mean, China has signed on to the Paris Accords and then promptly become the world's greatest emitter of carbon. So exactly how does anybody propose that that's going to be a practical solution?
So any climate economist would tell you, look, right now we're not pricing in the cost of emitting CO2. That leads to an inefficiency in the market system. So there's an argument for making a small, moderate carbon tax. What we should not do is expect partly that this is going to fix most of the problem. And also, of course, we need to recognize if we're going to do a carbon tax, you have to stop subsidizing renewable energy, have regulations like renewable obligations and so on. And so the reality here is it can be part of a solution. In principle, it should be, but in reality, it often will not be by any means the most effective and certainly the most likely to actually make a change. So yeah, probably something that we should look at, probably not the main part. This is, again, innovation and, as we talked about before, adaptation.
Bjorn Lomborg, president of Copenhagen Consensus Visiting Fellow at Hoover Institute. His new book is False Alarm: How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. Professor Lomborg, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Great to talk to you.